got some big news that just dropped last night, and I want to break it all down for you. So the Colorado Supreme Court has ruled that Donald Trump is disqualified from being on the presidential ballot under the 14th Amendment. So here's what they say in the ruling. In this appeal from a district court proceeding under the Colorado Election Code, the Supreme Court considers whether former President Donald J. Trump may appear on the Colorado Republican presidential primary ballot in 2024. A majority of the court holds that President Trump is disqualified from holding the office of president under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Because he is disqualified, it would be a wrongful act under the Election Code for the Colorado Secretary of State to list him as a candidate on the presidential primary ballot. The court stays its ruling until January 4th, 2024, subject to any further appellate proceedings. So what's going to happen here is Colorado made this decision. There are other states that have, other state courts that have come to the opposite conclusion. They know he can run. His name is going to be on the ballot. And so this is going to go directly to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to decide whether or not Trump can run. Now, you might be thinking, well, hold on, Kyle. The Supreme Court is overwhelmingly conservative, so this is like a foregone conclusion that he's going to be allowed on the ballot. I would say it is likely that they come to that conclusion, but it's actually not as set in stone as you might think, for the simple reason that the Supreme Court, look, in order to be a judge, in order to be a justice on the Supreme Court, you're highly, highly educated, and these people are massively conservative, and they're like originalists and textualists, and they go by like the plain face reading of the law and stuff, but they're like more like Mitt Romney style conservatives, guys. These are not like hardcore MAGA people. Even the ones that were literally appointed by Trump are not hardcore MAGA people. They're more like old school Mitt Romney style conservatives. So this is why you saw, for example, there were in the 61 court cases where Trump was trying to get the last election overturned, even his own appointed judges, super conservative judges, were like, not only am I not going to rule with you, I'm going to rule you don't even have standing. This shouldn't even be in court because your case is so goddamn weak. So when you had Trump judges saying that time, I mean, I would understand if people said, hey, this judge is Trump appointed, they're going to side with Trump. But that didn't even come close to happening in that instance. Now, in this instance, it's a little more complicated than that, but it's not as set in stone as you necessarily think it is. So let me walk you through it a little bit more here. So this is in Reuters, why Trump was disqualified from Colorado primary ballot and what it means. Donald Trump was disqualified from Colorado's presidential primary ballot by the state Supreme Court on Tuesday, an extraordinary ruling that could be struck down ahead of the November 2024 U.S. election. Here's a look at the decision and what it means for the former U.S. president and frontrunner in the 2024 Republican nomination. So here's what they say. A slim majority of the Colorado Supreme Court, it was a 4-3 decision, ruled that Trump is disqualified from appearing on the state's ballot under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. I'm going to read that section for you in just a minute as well, so hang on for that, which bars anyone engaged in insurrection or rebellion from holding federal office. A lower court judge, see, this is interesting, a lower court judge previously ruled that Trump's actions on January 6th during a violent attack on the U.S. Capitol by his supporters amounted to insurrection, but stopped short of disqualifying him, saying Section 3 does not apply to presidents. The Colorado Supreme Court paused its own ruling pending review by the U.S. Supreme Court, which Trump said he will immediately seek. So in other words, a lower court was like, yeah, we're not going to argue on the facts. We think on the facts he did commit insurrection. But they had this weird ruling where they said, well, the Supreme Court bars you from, or excuse me, the Constitution bars you from an elected office if you do an insurrection or aid and abet an insurrection. But we're not going to categorize the presidency as an office. What? That's like the silliest ruling I've ever heard in my life. That's absurd. Of course, it's the office of the presidency. Of course it is. It's like they're literally doing like semantic games and sophistry in order to say like, hey, we think he's kind of guilty, but we're going to go ahead and rule the other way anyway. So that's what happened at the lower court. So the higher court goes, no, that makes no sense. You're right that he engaged in an insurrection, but that does actually disqualify him. So now let's go to the exact text of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, also known as the Disqualification Clause, bars any person from holding federal or state office who took an oath to support the Constitution of the United States and then has engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. Okay, so that's really interesting to me because it's not only saying like, hey, you have to directly engage in an insurrection. It's saying if you give aid or comfort to enemies thereof. Well, you can argue whether or not Trump directly engaged in the insurrection himself, right? There is an argument to be had there. But I don't think you can really argue whether or not he gave aid and comfort to the enemies thereof. He obviously stoked the flames of the fire and prodded everybody to do what he wanted them to do, which was storm the Capitol and be strong and take your country back. Can't let them steal your country from you. Obviously tried to prod Mike Pence to overturn the results of the election, and even though Mike Pence didn't have that power, there's endless documented evidence on that exact thing. So, look, by the plain face reading... I mean, I don't know what you want me to say here. So, I also want to give you this. Colorado court, Trump is disqualified, finds Trump engaged in insurrection, incitement on January 6th, not protected speech, says Trump disqualified from being president, not eligible to appear on primary ballot, and Trump is filing with the Supreme Court immediately. Now, at the same time all this went down, I do have to show you this as well. Latest effort to boot Trump from election ballot fails. So, in this article, they talk about North Carolina. North Carolina election officials say they don't have the authority to take up a new effort to keep Donald Trump off the state ballot. So, and by the way, these are just the two most recent ones. I think there's way more examples than this. There's over 10, maybe over a dozen different cases on this exact thing. And in most instances, they are siding with Trump. Trump is winning most of these cases. But there's also another interesting thing to point out, which is this actually isn't unprecedented. The idea of saying, no, literally, you can't hold office because you were at January 6th and you engaged in the insurrection. There was a case of an elected official in New Mexico who lost his position because he was at January 6th. And my understanding is that's still the case. It wasn't like that was overturned when it went to a higher court. So in other cases, there are examples of like, you engaged in an insurrection. It says you can't hold any office if you did that. So you're donezo here, son. And so, I mean, that may also set a precedent for what's going to happen in the Supreme Court case. But having said that, it also might be the other cases that Trump won might be the precedent that these people rely on to say, we think he can run. So look, ultimately, how can this play out? I mean, there's a few different ways it could play out, right? The most obvious and straightforward way, and the most likely thing to happen is the Supreme Court just goes, we disagree. He can run. And then he's on the ballot everywhere. And that's the end of that. The other thing that could happen is you have a close decision, but ultimately you have like Roberts flipping and voting with the liberals, and you get a tight decision by one vote, and they say, no, actually, we think he can't run. There's also a weird middle ground that might happen, which is they could almost default to like a states' rights position and say, well, the states that decide that he can't run and are kicking him off the ballot, they're allowed to do that in those states. And the states that decide we want to allow him on the ballot, they're also allowed to do that. Now, I want to be clear, that's a very unlikely scenario. I think it is more likely, and Crystal and I were talking about this last night, it is more likely that they're just going to make a decision that's going to apply to the whole country, right? But there is a weird chance, like a 2 to 5% chance that they'll have a bizarre middle ground ruling like that, where it's like, he's off the ballot in Colorado, he's on the ballot in North Carolina, it is what it is, we're going to like punt on that. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Look, one argument people are making about this, which I thought was a decent argument at a time, was like, well, he hasn't been charged with insurrection. So you can't just say, or convicted of insurrection. He hasn't been charged or convicted of anything insurrection related. People talk about what he did in the context of, it's an insurrection. And I think that makes sense to describe it that way, but it's colloquially describing it that way. It's not like there isn't a conviction. It's not on his criminal record that I have committed insurrection, right? So in that scenario, you could see the Supreme Court saying, like, there is no conviction here. So I can't just say, yeah, you're kicked off the ballot. Like, you would need something more concrete than just, a narrative and a story of they did insurrection. And so since there's no conviction, it's like, they throw their hands up. What can I do? He's allowed to run. I think that's a fair argument. But at the same time, people are saying like, oh, there's been no due process here. So how can this be, how can they rule against Trump? But it's like, this is the due process, right? Like we're watching it unfold right now. So the Supreme Court hearing the case is the due process. So if the Supreme Court says, yeah, we think it was an insurrection and you can't run, well, then that does become settled law, right? So I don't know. I'm really interested to see how this plays out. I think it's like a 60 to 65% chance that they say, no, he can run and he can run it everywhere. But that's still, there could be like a 40% chance that they say, no, he can't run. And again, the reason I say that is because these are like Mitt Romney type conservatives. The Supreme Court is very consistent and predictable on corporate related issues. They're always going to side with the corporations. But on social issues, sometimes they surprise you. Like they'll throw a twist at you and you're like, I didn't see that coming at all. It's like Gorsuch randomly being massively in favor of indigenous rights. I think it's Gorsuch, right? Who does that? Like, you'd be surprised. Sometimes they'll hit you with something. And again, these are judicial conservatives. These are Mitt Romney type conservatives. These are highly educated, elite law school, Ivy League types who don't actually like Trump. And so here you have it's almost like, it's like at the last minute, you have this Hail Mary pass, which could just finally rid the country of Trump. And I don't know, man, they might actually go for it. Because another important point to make is the Supreme Court are buddy-buddy with the donor class, right? Well, guess what? The donor class is all in on Nikki Haley. They love Nikki Haley. They don't want Trump to be president. They don't. He brings massive instability. I mean, look, Trump is good for them in the sense that they get their tax cuts and they get their deregulation. But he's bad for them and everybody in the sense that you don't know if he's going to leave the next time there's an election, right? You don't know if he's going to leave. And they notice that just as much as everybody else notices that, and they don't like that. It brings instability in the markets, and there's massive downsides to that. So they'd much rather have Nikki Haley than Trump. So there's like a donor, lobbyist, money-related reason why they might rule against Trump. And there's also like an ideological reason they might vote against Trump because they fancy themselves like elitist conservatives who are very intellectual. They're not like the MAGA Republicans. There is a track record of these sorts of Trump-appointed judges bucking orthodoxy and telling him to piss off when he comes to them with something ridiculous, like trying to overturn the election. So I don't know, man. It'll be really interesting to see this unfold. And honestly, from my perspective, I could see either argument winning out. I could see the argument of he wasn't actually convicted for insurrection, nor was he even charged with insurrection. Therefore, you can't say he quote unquote did an insurrection and kick him off the ballot. Sorry, Trump wins. I could see that. Or I could see them saying, look, man, this plain-faced reading of the Constitution, here, I'll pull it up for you one more time. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is the disqualification clause, and it bars any person from holding federal or state office who took an oath to support the Constitution of the United States and then has engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. It's very easy to look at that and say, plain-faced reading of this, that is exactly what he did. He did try to overthrow the election, right? This was an attempted insurrection. Obviously, in their heart of hearts, what they wanted to happen was for it to succeed, and you block the approval process of Joe Biden. And so since that's what they were attempting to do, since that's what they were trying to do, since the wheels were in motion and they actually took actions along those lines, and since Trump was like the ringleader of the whole thing, as many people will testify to in court, yeah, you committed insurrection. And so the plain-faced reading is, sorry, son, you're done here. So I don't know, man. It'll be interesting to see it unfold. There's an argument, there has been no due process and he hasn't been convicted, so you can't do it. There's an argument, this is the due process, and if you do the plain-faced reading, he is guilty of it, so I don't know. We'll see it unfold. Again, I'm going to put it at 60 to 65% he wins, but there is a solid 35, 40% chance he doesn't win. And honestly, even though any decision is going to lead to backlash, right? This might be the best way. This might be the least bad way to rip that Band-Aid off. If the Supreme Court says, sorry, man, we think you can't run. That might be the easiest way to rip the Band-Aid off. Because I've been talking about all the potential scenarios, watching them play out, right? Like how this is going to unfold. And some of them, I haven't thought of any scenario that ends good, right? There's no scenario that just ends positively. If Trump wins the primary and Trump wins the general, we get another 4 years of Trump. If Trump wins the primary and loses the general, he says he won the general. If Trump loses the primary, he says that was stolen from him and causes a big stink. You could have massive protests and massive riots from the Trump people if they don't get their way, or you could have massive protests and riots from the Democrats and the left if they don't get their way and Trump gets back in there. There was the biggest protest in U.S. history, the Women's March, right after Trump got elected the first time. What do you think is going to happen this time, right? And they're talking about maybe invoking the Insurrection Act against Democrats and the left if Trump ends up winning. So I don't see a good, positive outcome that's like a least bad outcome. That is until this. If the Supreme Court decides, sorry, man, we think Section 3 of the 14th Amendment applies to you. We think you can't be president again. If they decide that, you still might have Trump people in the streets. They might be really pissed off. But I do think after like 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month, it'd be like, well, we all kind of saw the writing on the wall anyway. There's 91 criminal charges against Trump. We felt like there's no way he's going to get back in there anyway. He's up against the deep state and the establishment, and it turns out the deep state and the establishment ended up winning. I do think eventually they move on, right? And to have the Supreme Court, which is an overwhelmingly conservative body, be the one to say, no, we're putting a stop to this now because we think Section 3 of the 14th Amendment applies. That's the least bad outcome. Because then he can't say, oh, it's Joe Biden, you know, like, oh, it's the left. He can't make that argument. In that scenario, it would be the conservative Republicans and it would be the conservative donor class, right? So, and then Trump would rip apart the Republicans in general, which might have positive outcomes as well. So, I don't know, man. Really interesting. This is going to be like fast track to the Supreme Court now. And I don't know when they're going to make a final decision on it, but this will be a huge, huge deal. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop. And watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.